Welcome to Season 4 of the Comfortably Hungry podcast, where yesterday's dinner is tomorrow's history. If you're a peckish person who is curious about the history of food and drink, then you're in the right place. I'm Sam Bilton, an author of some rather niche books who adores her history and food. And by the end of this podcast, I hope you'll be a fan of food history too. You can see what historical delicacies I'm cooking at the moment on Instagram, Threads or Blue Sky at Mrs. Bilton, that's with 2 S's. In Season 4, we're going to be immersing ourselves in the fascinating world of fresh water, which as we all know is vital to life. We'll be journeying through the centuries to learn more about the food, drink and medicines water provides, its spiritual significance, discovering how water has been used to prepare and preserve our victuals, and how water has been utilised as a source of power and transportation for the food sector. Some of the topics will be obvious, but as ever, I hope that one or two will be pleasantly surprising. As with earlier seasons of the Comfortably Hungry podcast, the guests will be invited to bring a dish to the season's virtual potluck supper. And we've had some delicious contributions, I can tell you. The paid subscribers to the Comfortably Hungry Substack will also get access to recipes inspired by the topics covered in this season. According to the rat in Kenneth Grahame's Wind in the Willows, there is nothing half so much worth doing as simply messing about in boats. And while that may be the case for the leisured classes, like Jerome K. Jerome's protagonists in 3 Men and a Boat, and of course their dog Montmorency, for the people who worked on Britain's rivers and canals, there was no messing about. As we will hear in today's episode, the life of those who were employed on our waterways was hard, but they played a crucial role in our food system, transporting imported raw materials like grain, cacao and limes to factories inland, where they could be transformed into delicious products, from your everyday loaf to the lime cordial you use in a gimlet. Welcome to the podcast, Di.
Thank you.
It's lovely to have you here. Di, you and I know each other through the Guild of Food Writers, but can you explain why you and your husband Tam have such an affinity with canals and barges?
Oh gosh, we've got, how long have we got? Well, I'll put it all in a nutshell. I guess the first thing to say is that we were children of the 60s, which was a fairly free period if you were young and you got to travel, you got to hitchhike, you got to do all sorts of things. First of all, I ran away to sea when I was 16 and got as far as Isleworth on the Thames and then moved on to an old wooden sailing barge. And really, I got quite interested in river life, I think. Just by living on these old boats. There were not so many houseboat dwellers then as there are now. It was a fairly specialised group of people, quite a lot of very individual people, artists, eccentrics, loners and things. So it was a nice community. But also the river itself was very active, full of working traffic then, barges and tugs going up and down. And I suppose I just began to absorb that kind of thing. And then after that, it never occurred to me to think about moving into a house. And I met Tam, and we then produced our first child fairly quickly. And we needed somewhere to live. And we couldn't find anywhere on the river. And then we found this sunken barge.
You found a sunken barge, okay.
A sunken barge. And beside a dredging tip on the canal. And the driver of the crane showed us this barge and he said, "You want this barge? This is the barge you want." And we'd say, no, it's sunk. And what if can we pump it up? He said, no, just go to the office, which is what they called the British Waterways Centre, and tell them you want to buy it. So we went and we offered them 50 quid. And the next day we had a letter from British Waterways saying, "Please remove this sunken craft from our premises immediately." And so we're kind of just in a panic. Anyway, George the crane he said, "Don't you worry, my ducks. You come back in the morning." We came back in the morning, and there she was floating, and Tam converted that barge literally by hand with no electric tools. And we lived very happily on the Progress for I suppose about 10 years or so. And again, all the time, there was still working traffic, these wonderful canal boats going up and down, loaded with families on board. People lived on these boats full time. I mean, I found it fascinating. And we got to know a lot of these people, these families. They couldn't read or write. They were very uneducated, but they were so intelligent and knew boating sort of absolutely every which way. That's really where we began to come into this real interest in preserving, helping to preserve a way of life. I don't want to make it sound, as though we were sort of rushing about trying to save the world. But we did think that this was a trade that should continue on the water for as long as possible.
The canals were a vital part, weren't they, of the British food system?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And in fact, where we lived, I mean, we lived at the bottom end of the Grand Union Canal, and the Grand Union Canal connected with the River Thames at Brentford. And of course, from Brentford downstream to the London docks, this was where all the produce, all the raw materials of the world, of colonial world, came into Britain. Tea, coffee, imported meat from South America, just everything came in. And then it would be taken to various factories and processing places where it'd be turned into finished goods and shipped right back out to the places that it had come from. But of course, the crucial thing about the canal and the river was you were able to have goods, raw materials brought up to Brentford by barge, towed up from the docks by tugboats. And then they came into what we call the Brentford Depot, which was the bottom of the Grand Union Canal. And there, a lot of these raw materials were going to factories that were based beside the canal. So companies like, I know, J. Lyons, Wolsey's, Ovaltine's, what was called Hayes cocoa in those days that was brought up by Nestles. These were all places on the canal where this stuff was taken to. And of course, the other side of it was the canal system connected with the Midlands collieries. And coal was what all of these factories and processing plants and mills depended upon. So there was coal coming down the canals from the Midlands directly to the back doors, to the wharves of these places. And the unprocessed beans and whatever, fruit, meat, was coming up from the river to the same places. And so it was for many, many years, it was a perfect match, really.
So presumably people like Fry's and Cadbury's, although Fry's were based out in Bristol, so maybe not so much then, but they were bringing the cocoa beans in and shipping them
up absolutely.
The canals. The canals would have predated like the rail system, wouldn't they, for sure?
They definitely did. It's terribly difficult now in the world that we live in, but if you can imagine, the only way you could transport goods other than by water was by horses and carts, and the most they could carry was about a ton. And when they built canals, suddenly you could transport 50 tons.
Yeah.
Just drawn by one horse. That made just a phenomenal difference. And of course, sort of was kickstarting the Industrial Revolution and from all else followed. But the railway age came quite quickly, essentially after the building of the canals. It was maybe only 50, 60 years where water transport reigned on its own. But the thing people forget about railways is that there has to be somewhere where they can intersect. There has to be somewhere. Goods yards. Goods yards are about taking stuff off one train and putting it on another. It's not as simple as was at that time at the canal, bringing those raw materials from source directly, no double handling in the sense of taking them out of one transport system and putting them on another. And of course, that was really quite crucial for a long, long time. I mean, yes, railways and canals were in competition with each other for many, many years. But the whole canal freight carrying system held its own for a good 100 years after railways came. And you could say, really, the death knell was actually the Clean Air Act coming in the 1950s, which meant that the use of coal and coke for firing, for energy to produce all these goods, it was going over to electricity and gas in order to have much cleaner air. I mean, people died from all this sort of coal smog.
So this is the use of the factories that were processing the goods that were coming into the country rather than the canal boats, because just to be clear, it's not the canal boats can't be held responsible for bad air in the UK.
No, we're talking about all of these factories. And of course, the other thing was the improvements in the road system.
Yes.
But for years and years, you could only transport 15 tons as a maximum. That was a big lorry. So it wasn't until the roads were being developed in such a way that you could get heavier and heavier, larger and larger vehicles moving more and more stuff. And of course, all of those factories beside the canal, if they weren't having their coal, why wouldn't they move to somewhere where they had a good road system?
So let's talk about Rose's Lime Cordial. I've been lucky enough to have a preview of your next book, which we will come on to. We'll discuss your other books as well shortly. But Rose's Lime Cordial, I thought this story was fantastic because lime juice, obviously, limes don't grow in the UK, not yet anyway. So let's talk about how the limes got here and how Rose's Lime Cordial came about. And we'll then go on to discuss your involvement in this.
Well, of course, initially, Lachlan Rose, who started the company, I mean, they were up in Scotland and they were, I think they were shipbuilders. He became, as an adult, he became an importer of various goods. So that connection with bringing stuff from other countries. He was also a chemist that people don't really realise. And one of the things that he did, and probably the crucial thing as far as Rose's lime juice was concerned, was he found a way of producing the citrus fruits, the juice of citrus like lemons and limes, of preserving it without needing to add alcohol. And of course, although the British Navy, they didn't really understand what caused scurvy. That's where we're going. So this terrible condition that if you are for long enough without sort of quite vital vitamins, the body begins to suffer, and eventually people died from scurvy. And in fact, more British sailors died from scurvy than ever they did from fighting in battles. And the way the Navy got over it was they understood about lemon juice, but in order to have it on board their ships, they had to find a way of preserving it, and so they served it with rum. So there was a bit of a downside to this, serving your sailors every day with rum. Anyway, he found a way of preserving the lemons so that they could be on board without having to add the alcohol content.
And what period are we talking about here?
We're kind of middle of the 1800s. I mean, not such a long time ago. His ability to import lemons was curtailed for various reasons, and he had to look for another source of citrus, and he settled on limes. And initially he was bringing limes in from the West Indies, and then he began to import them from West Africa. Roses literally cornered the market in limes. And again, these raw materials had to come to Britain to be processed and turned back into sort of finished goods. And although, as it turned out, lime juice doesn't have anything like the sufficient properties in it to curtail scurvy, lemon is much, much better. At the same time that all of this was going on, you're getting ships moving from sail to steam, faster journeys. You have the Suez Canal being opened, which meant that journeys that used to take months by sea were shortened by this ability to go through the Suez Canal. Because they had to take on coal, ships were stopping in far more places and taking on far more fresh food. And surprise, surprise, scurvy began to disappear. Not because of the lime juice, in fact, but because they were getting far more fresh meat and fresh vegetables, and the journey time was quicker, and they weren't at sea for so long. But nevertheless, the Navy kept buying the lime juice. And as it slowly dawned on everybody that actually they didn't need it anymore, Roses was beginning to suffer the company. Then in the 1930s, they invented the wonderful Roses marmalade, and that turned everything round for them. Lime juice, of course, continued because of the very famous gimlet, this wonderful cocktail which spread across the drinking world. So every single bar always had a bottle of lime juice cordial on their shelves to mix with the gin. But the nature of Roses sort of changed in a way, or the end result, what they were about, began to change. They moved the company down to London from Scotland, and then his premises in London were bombed out during the Second World War, and they took themselves off to Hemel Hempstead, which is not terribly well known, but it's on the Grand Union Canal, about 30 miles up from Brentford. He continued to produce his lime juice, this raw lime material that was exported from West Africa in wooden barrels, wax-lined wooden barrels, was put into ships. The ships came to the London docks. The barrels were then put into lighters, barges that transported them up the river to Brentford. And it was at Brentford that the lime juice, all these barrels were stored. It's very seasonal. So they'd all start coming in, all the lime juice would start coming in towards sort of late August, early September, and it would be stacked and stored at Brentford, and then slowly transported up the canal to Roses lime juice at Hemel Hempstead.
And you were involved in this, weren't you? You in town were actually involved in doing the lime run, as it's called.
We were involved, but the question I suppose most people would be asking at this point is, well, if everybody else had gone off and set up next to motorways, how come Roses are still sat there beside the canal? and right up until the 1980s, we're not talking a century ago.
No.
The barrels were still coming up the canal. And the reason, again, another of these things where you don't immediately see the connection. When London River was so full of ships and the wharves along the river just could not cope with them, this was when they started to build the enclosed docks. First ones, I think, late 1600s, and they continued to build enclosed docks along the river for another 100 or more years. And every one of those docks had to receive an act of Parliament to allow the developers to make them to compulsory purchase land, to set out all the regulations and things. And of course, when these enclosed docks were being built, all the ship owners, all the barge owners, all the wharf owners along the river were saying, well, what happens to us? Our trade goes. Because the idea was ships went into these enclosed docks, they unloaded straight onto the shore into warehouses, and then those goods were then moved by road or by rail. So the river transport was effectively going to finish. So every single act of parliament that was passed for each of these enclosed docks included something which is known to this day as the Free Water Clause. And that said, any barge or lighter can come into the enclosed docks, no payment, no charge, and the ship owners can put their goods into those barges and they can be taken back out and taken to somewhere else, which meant that the traffic continued on the river, but also the owners were able to find cheaper ways of storing their goods and moving their goods. And it just happened because Roses was able to be literally waterborne from source to manufacturing point, and they could go into the London docks to load their stuff, take it up to Brentford, where their storage was so much cheaper and so much easier, and canal transport was cheaper and easier. You're talking about pre-M25s.
Yes.
Actually crossing London at that time, you may even remember, what by car, by road, was really difficult going across central London to get from one side to the other. So that water route continued to be a useful route for many, many years after the modern road system was being developed and the M25 came along. So that's why Roses continued to have their lime juice up to Hemel and all the way by water. And that's how we became involved. So going back to the beginning of this, where I was saying, we were really interested in these boat people, and the canal boats, if you saw them, were so beautiful. They looked like floating fairgrounds, the lettering on the side, the roses and castles.
Yeah.
There's a whole romantic thing about it, in spite of the fact the boat people were hugely hardworking and really had very, very tough lives. We thought we knew loads about boating. We'd been on boats for years and years. We'd been here, there and everywhere. Progress we took up to Birmingham. We took along the Thames. We were on the Wey, the Lee, the Stort, all the southern rivers. So we knew it all. We noticed one day that the lime juice boats had stopped coming past us. They came past us every couple of days. So I phoned down to the manager at Brentford and said, "Where's the lime juice?" And he said, "Oh, well, we've got terrible problems. Two of the boats have got engine problems, and we don't really see that they're going to be repaired. Times are changing." And I said, "Oh, we've got a boat. We had just bought our first narrowboat, a first working boat." And he said, "Will you be down here on Monday morning at 7:00 and load you?" I put the phone down. I said to Tam, "Apparently we're going to go and load lime juice." And we did. These boats work in pairs, 2 narrowboats, 70 foot long, 7 feet wide. Between them carry about 50 tons. And one boat has the engine, which is always known as the motorboat, and it tows the butty, which is the dumb boat. They have tiny cabins on each boat, which whole families, huge families, were born and raised in. And so we set off and we loaded down at Brentford. We had no idea what we were doing. But luckily, the men that loaded us were ex-boatmen. And I always remember, with great affection, he was known as Harry the Horse, Harry Creswell, who had been boating since there were horse-drawn canal boats. And Fred Dell, who was probably the last proper boatman doing the lime juice. They'd both be telling you what they used to say was, how to go on, me ducks. You need to know how to go on. Which meant they were telling you what to look out for, where you're going to have a problem, what you needed to do. And although they were not the most articulate of people, there was a lot of hand waving, we learned our first journey, which should have taken 12 hours, took us over 36 hours.
Wow, why was that?
Because we spent most of our time on the bottom of the canal or the boat, aground, or, I mean, there was just so much we didn't know. We had no idea. Taking boats loaded with 50 tons upper canals in not terribly good condition by then. And you had 33 locks to go through, all of which we had to do ourselves. There were no lock keepers or anything. And if you came to a bit of canal where it was empty, you had to get on your bike and ride up the canal and run water down until you'd filled that pound. So it was a true, I was going to say, a baptism by fire, baptism by water anyway. And the boats were overloaded. That was the other thing. We just said, load our boats the way you used to do it. I think we weren't overloaded that much, but enough to cause us a problem. So we went back to Brentford, and I think they were all surprised to see these people, because we were off the bank. We weren't proper boat people. We were these Johnny-come-latelys. And we just kept on going. We kept asking questions. We went to the pub, the brewery tap on a Sunday night when all the boat people were in there. And we'd say, oh, we were just coming into this lock and the boat stopped and we didn't know what to do. And they'd say, oh, well, that was because of da-da-di-da. And they'd explain, where we'd gone wrong, what we hadn't understood. They shared this knowledge from generations and generations of boat people with us, for which we were always eternally grateful. And I just admired them so much. They were just so, so great. But really from the lime juice, we started carrying coal. We got into aggregates. We moved out onto the Thames. We carried grain. We loaded down at Tilbury Grain Terminal, up to Cox's Mill at Weybridge. And so it was a whole completely different way of life.
And it's, as you say, you've already said how hardworking boat people are, but it's certainly not an easy way of life, is it? Because as well as the physical work that you have to do, there's adverse weather you had to deal with, isn't there?
Especially with the lime juice, because that used to be essentially something you would be running up to Roses through the winter months, because it came in and you'd keep moving it until that season's lime juice had finished. So a lot of the work was done in the dark, because it would be dark by 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon. The weather was not quite as mild then as it is now. And sometimes the canal would be frozen, really, really frozen. And you'd have to break ice with the motorboat. And of course, you were towing a second boat. And sometimes you'd find you get to a lock and there'd be so much ice behind the gates, you couldn't get the pair of boats into the lock. You'd have to take them through one by one. So, I mean, it just could be really, really tough. But there was no question of stopping. That was the thing. That doesn't happen on the canal.
No.
As they used to say, go steady, but keep on a going, me ducks.
So why did food become such an important factor then, why you were doing this job?
Well, I mean, there was the practical side of it, because if you're working with boats, the only time you have to actually do any shopping is when the boats are being loaded or unloaded. So usually the loading took, I don't know, about 3 hours, unloading probably about the same. So then it was my job to get on the bike and go down to Brentford Market and buy food and be back in time before the boats were ready to go. And if we'd forgotten anything, at Rickmansworth, there was this wonderful canal side shop called John's Stores that was a real, open all hours sort of place. And the boat people always used it. And they used it because John understood their lives. There was a lock beside the shop. The boats went into the lock. Somebody, me, would step off as the boats were going into the lock, go to John's Stores, and he would serve in time for when the lock had filled and the boats were ready to leave. And by the time the lock was filled and the boats were ready to leave, I was coming out of John's stores to step back on with, all these various bits and pieces, nice things he used to sell. He used to sell fig rolls right next to his.
Oh, I love a fig roll.
Right next to the till, and you could never go out of there without a packet of fig rolls and things. There was a lady who lived in one of the lock house, and she used to make these wonderful, wonderful pies. And we used to be desperate to get there sort of during the day when we could buy these lovely fruit pies. And sort of, if it was dark when we got there, she wasn't serving. And I used to make bread pudding, those really solid bread puddings from all the bread we used to eat. We used to eat huge amounts of food because the work was really, really hard. It was hard. And we only had a tiny, tiny little coal-fired range. Literally, it just had an oven and a couple of things on the top. And that range was in the butty cabin, just at the foot of the steps. So you steered the boat from the back with a great big wooden tiller, and the heat from the range would just come up the little bit open hatches, the hatches we called them, and keep you warm. And of course, if you had a slow cooking, beef stew and dumplings just sat there ready for when you stopped, it would just sort of keep you going. It would really keep you going.
I was going to say, it must have been very so almost torturous, smelling the aromas of the stew.
Oh, absolutely.
You're working your absolute socks off.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
You can't just suddenly decide to abandon your post, can you?
And bearing in mind that all the cooking was done on the butty. I used to steer the butty, the second boat. We would be on a long tow. The motorboat would be in front with a tow line, sometimes about 30 feet, sometimes 70 feet, depending upon how many locks and various other technical things like that. So to get a cup of tea to your captain, who was like 70 foot away from you, was quite an undertaking. So you'd have to wait till you got to a lock, and you'd quickly pass stuff over when you were sharing the lock. Then sort of out you go.
So what did you do for drinking water? Because obviously there wouldn't have been running water. Well, I'm assuming. So I've never been on a canal boat, but I'm assuming there's no running water that you haven't got. Or do you have a water tank?
We had cans, which were on the canal known as Buckby cans. Cans, they were made at Buckby. And they would be about 2-3 gallon. We just carried the water in. We probably only had about 5 gallons of water on board at any one time. There were taps, not many of them. And in fact, in the winter, if a tap had frozen, it was devastating, because if you couldn't get any drinking water, you couldn't have a cup of tea en route. And so that seems like a very small thing, but in a job like that, where it's bitterly cold and you're wet, it's dark, everything's miserable, what you really want is a cup of tea.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we were very dependent upon these taps en route, but essentially on the boat, you had 2 beautifully painted cans, and they always sat on the same position next to the chimney where the range came up, and the chimney always had 3 polished brass bands on it. And one of the beautiful things about these canal boats, the boat people worked so hard, and yet these boats were immaculate. The vast majority of them were immaculate, beautifully painted. Every bit of brass, the portholes, the rings round the exhaust pipe on the engine, all were polished to just gleaming every single day. It seemed so silly and so small, but I think it was just because that sort of life was being carried on in full view of the rest of the world. It wasn't as though you were, I don't know, in darkest Africa or, sort of in Tibet or somewhere. You were doing this completely different thing in view of the whole world that was just going on around you. And yet it's a bit like, I suspect, a bit like being a long distance lorry driver. People have no idea of how they live, those drivers, where they know where to stop, where they get their food. The canal boat people's lives were, again, different in the sense that nobody knew what they did, but they could see them. They could see these beautifully painted boats. They could see them going along. And a lot of people have long, long memories of what they used to call the painted boats. And so maybe if they'd been really rough and ready and harsh, that bit of romance that they always have, we might not have been quite so attracted to it being, kind of like, I don't know, middle-class intellectuals or whatever. So there was an interest in the lifestyle and in the history of the boats and this desire to keep some sort of traffic, some sort of trade going by water instead of sending it all onto the roads, which was what was beginning to happen. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I can remember one night, I was standing under this bridge below a lock. I was doing what they call lock wheeling. So I was on the bike going up, setting each lock before the boats got there so that the gates were open and we'd go straight in. And I was just stood there looking down this very straight bit of canal, and I could see the headlights of the motor and the butty as they were coming along. And I was just waiting for them to come. And it was sleeting down. I was standing under the bridge, the only dry place. And this cat came out of nowhere and literally came and sat down next to me. And I thought, there's nobody else in the world at this moment who is standing, looking at a cat, waiting for her boats to arrive at this lock. And I thought, I'm truly, truly content at this moment.
Yeah.
I'm doing exactly what I really want to be doing. And that's quite rare,
Yes.
It's quite a rare thing to be completely content in that moment. Maybe the cat wasn't that content, but yeah.
Knowing what cats are like, the cat was probably like, yeah, you'll do for now.
Yeah.
Anyway, your travels and your experiences have so far generated 2 books, Barges and Bread, and a foodie afloat.
We finally fetched up with 3 small ships, I have to say, coasters that operated around the Thames estuary and eventually across to the Netherlands. We weren't like, I wasn't like Jackie Onassis or anything. These were your very small coasting barges, a few hundred tons. So we kind of progressed in the boating world, but I did start writing. I started writing about the lives of the boat people, and you will know Petit Propos Culinaire.
Indeed, I do, yes.
And Tom Jane was still the editor, and I'd written this thing about what the boat people used to do, how they fed themselves. And he said, well, of course I'm going to print it, but I think you should put it in for the Sophie Co Prize. And I'm going, Sophie Co? What's Sophie Co? And so he explained to me that it was this very prestigious prize for writings on food history, really, or any aspect of food. And then sometime later, I get a phone call saying, oh, you've just won the Sophie Co Prize. And I was saying, oh, what? Please come to Oxford to collect your prize. So that's really where that sort of started. And then Prospect asked me if I would write a book, but I wanted to show the connection between water transport and how, for instance, London as a city grew from, probably a few houses, a settlement, into this huge city. And the obvious thing is you can only feed people of that size by bringing enough grain in by water.
Yeah.
So for a city to grow, it has to be on some kind of navigable water, either the sea or a navigable river, because eventually that's the only way that you can get enough food to that city, and that food allows the city to grow. So it's one of those sort of circular things. And because by then we'd had this contract with Allied Mills to carry Canadian hard wheat from Tilbury grain terminal, right at the bottom end of the Thames, up to this little mill on the River Wey. I really knew quite a lot about the practical side. Often if you're an academic, you know your subject inside out, but you don't get into it in that way. So talking about transporting goods by water inland, I actually knew, I knew how to do it. I knew the answers to lots of questions that people would ask. So that's really where the writing came from. We, personally, Tam and I, were really coming to the end of our barging careers here in the UK. So the next book I wrote, the next proper book I wrote, was called Foodie Afloat. But this was much more to do with how, as you move across a landscape, you move across France by water, which is a very slow way to travel. And also because you've got this big converted barge, your kitchen and your sort of eating areas are the size of a small house or an apartment. So you're not, tied in some tiny little space where you're trying to do things. So it did mean that as we moved across France, we could go to markets, we could buy food, I could cook food, but you could see how food changed, how what people ate changed with the region that you were moving through. There was a very slow change, and you could see how French markets sustained the whole traditional dishes in France, because the people that came to the market, the growers, grew what they knew their customers wanted in season, and their customers came to the market expecting to buy certain things. I found that really interesting, coming from this mishmash of a world where, everything is available, and seeing how what was available in markets began to change as you moved across, down the country, because we start from the north, eventually on a whole canal system in the north and the middle of France, eventually just becomes the River Saône and then the Rhone, and there's this one route down to the south, and then it spreads out again a little bit. You've got virtually all the cuisines of various regions of France there by water. So that was what a Foodie Afloat was about.
So, Di, we've heard lots about your travels and your work on the canals, but I'm curious to know what you will bring to the season's virtual potluck supper as your contribution.
I thought a lot about this, and I thought initially, the obvious thing is a gimlet. Let's have the gin and the lime juice, which could be a side drink. But actually, what personified really us working on canals was something the boat people used to call it trouser leg pudding.
Oh, I love it. Trouser leg pudding. So tell us what trouser leg pudding is.
And it was a bit of the old man's trouser leg, obviously nice and clean. And they used to make this suet pudding. And so the bottom end of the trouser was tied up tightly. So it made a kind of container for the suet pudding. And then when the pudding was in there, the top was tied. And then it could just sit on the range, bubbling away for hours. And this trouser leg pudding, we call it bacon pudding. It's a suet pudding. So suet, good old datura, and flour and water, and onions, sage, and what I call bacon bits, just bits of old bacon cut up. It is fabulous. And we used to eat it with Swedes, mashed Swedes full of butter.
Oh, yes.
Butter and cream, mashed Swedes. And I used to make a sort of a kind of mustardy gravy to pour over this. Yeah, trouser leg pudding and mashed Swede. Just wonderful. And I still make it today. Not so often. It's got to be pretty cold before you're ready to eat a big wodge of suet pudding. But I love it. And suet puddings are becoming another lost thing.
Yes. So what is next on the horizon for you? We've already alluded to this, but can you tell us a bit more about your next project?
I just had this idea of writing a book about the Thames, because I know the River Thames very well. And I suddenly had this eureka moment. What I would do, I'd have a culinary journey down the Thames from source to sea. And at the moment, I've called the book River Fed, but perhaps the publisher will want to change that. But it's starting right up in the chalk streams where the Thames begins its journey, as it were, and writing about watercress and trout, and slowly moving down cheese at Abingdon. Abingdon was once the greatest inland cheese port in England. Not a lot of people know that.
No, I did not know that.
And then coming down, talking about Brentford, the connection with lime juice, Richmond, Maids of Honour tarts, coming on down the river into London. I thought, I'll write about Southwark. I'll write about Southwark Market. And then when I got into it, discovered that the whole history of the hop industry and how ale was changed to beer by sort of Dutch incomers settling in Kent with their knowledge of hops, how hops, sort of lengthen the life of beer. And on down, tea from China coming into the East India docks. I sort of finally fetch up down at Tilbury, talking about the Western family who brought Canadian grain and changed the whole face of bread making in this country, turned it into a factory product, which we've suffered from for the last 60 years, and we're getting out of now, hopefully. And on down to Morden Sea Salt. We're just in the Essex marshes, and the whole story of sea salt is in itself a fascinating one. So it's various places along the Thames. My next book, which could be my final book because I'm no spring chicken, is actually still about canals, but it's about a Victorian brickmaker. It's a book I've wanted to write for donkey's years. It's a true story. And it's about it's a sort of David and Goliath type tale. And at the moment it's called Pocock versus the Grand Junction Canal Company. And that is in the writing.
It's been fascinating talking to you today about the canals and your life on the canals. And I've learnt loads that I didn't know before. And I'm going to put links, as I said, to A Foodie Afloat and Barges and Bread in the show notes. And I will alert my listeners when Riverfed, or whatever it ends up being called, is released. I'm sure you'll keep me in touch as to when that's coming out. And I look forward to hearing more about the book with on the Victorian brickmaker, because that sounds fascinating.
Well, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.
Do keep an eye out for Di's book Riverfed, which fingers crossed will be available later this year. In the meantime, you can find links to her other books, A Foodie Afloat and Barges and Bread, in the show notes. In the next episode, I will be travelling further back in time than I ever have before, as I journey to the land between two rivers. That's right, I'll be visiting ancient Mesopotamia to learn more about possibly the world's earliest beer culture. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you really loved it, please rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, as it really will help other listeners discover Comfortably Hungry. Don't forget to pop along to sambilton.com, where you'll find details on my books, which include my latest publication, Much Ado About Cooking, written in collaboration with Shakespeare's Globe. This new cookbook features recipes inspired by the food in the Bard plays, and was huge fun to write, so I think it will be right up your street. You may also want to subscribe to the Comfortably Hungry Substack, which includes more detailed notes from the show. You can subscribe for free, but if you become a paid subscriber for £3.50 a month, you'll also get recipes inspired by the topics covered in the show and access to extra content. Alternatively, you can leave me a one-off tip via Ko-fi to show your appreciation. Just click on the relevant link in the show notes. Your support will help fund the research required to produce Comfortably Hungry. It also means that I can avoid including those pesky ads that may interfere with your enjoyment of the podcast. If you have any questions relating to this season's theme, you can leave a comment in the chat section of the Comfortably Hungry Substack page or tag me on social media. Remember, you can find me on Instagram, Threads and Blue Sky at Mrs. Bilton, that's with 2 S's. I'll be plunging back into the liquid world of food and drink history soon, but until then, take care. Comfortably Hungry is research produced and presented by food historian Sam Bilton, with sound mixing and production by Thomas Dinas of the Delicious Legacy podcast. Additional sound effects and music are provided by Zapsplat and Pom5.